Hi, I'm Gordon Draper, your host for the Cyber Consulting Room podcast. Join us for a captivating interview with Helen Patton, Cybersecurity Executive Advisor and former CSO of Cisco. In a two-part special edition over 2 episodes, we'll meet Helen Patton and hear her wisdom that she's gained from being driven by a powerful belief. Superior business outcomes are all about empowering people. In the first of the 2-part podcast interview, we'll delve into Helen's unique perspective on building organizational security cultures. You'll hear how she leverages her deep industry connections to translate cybersecurity into tangible business success for organizations across all sectors. Additionally, Helen's extensive experience influencing public policy promises insights into shaping a more secure and trustworthy digital future. Prepare to be inspired by her dedication to empowering both businesses and individuals to thrive in the ever-evolving technological landscape as we talk in this episode of the Cyber Consulting Room podcast. Hey, Helen, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So just to get started, how did you get into cybersecurity or information security?
So I've been in cyber for a really long time, like more decades than I want to admit at this point, which means I'm old enough to say that when I first got into cybersecurity, there was no obvious path and it was a complete accident. So in the 90s, I was doing generic IT work, so networks, database administration, endpoint management, those kinds of things. And I bumped into Y2K, software, malware and worms, those kinds of problems. And I had a boss who ultimately said, "Oh, we need a security program, and Helen, you're it." So it was all by accident. And that seems to be the theme of my entire career is every time I thought I've made a choice to go to a new job and a new role, pretty much as soon as I show up at that new job or new role, something changed that I hadn't anticipated. And it was a completely different thing than I thought. And it still worked out for me anyway. So yeah, getting into cybersecurity was an accident. And actually most of my career has followed suit.
A happy accident.
Right.
So it's been fruitful from the sounds of it. It's been a journey.
Yes, absolutely. It's been great.
What education qualifications and industry certifications do you have?
So I am a non-traditional student. So right from the start, I grew up in Australia. I started university. I actually took a gap year between high school and university. And so I started working right away and I never really stopped. So I've always been a full-time working adult who happened to take classes at night. So my undergrad degree took me about 13 years to complete.
Oh, wow.
Part-time. I changed my major 4 times. So I started doing HR and then I moved to English and then I moved to MIS, Management Information Systems. And then ultimately I got an undergrad degree in business administration. And then I had that for about a decade. And then I went back and I got a master's degree in public policy with a focus on technology policy. So that's my formal sort of education. Cybersecurity certifications, I have let all of them lapse that I used to have. But over the years, I had a CISA, I had a CISM, I had a C-RISC, and then I also had a business continuity professional certification because that's actually where I got started.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. What advice would you give to people with regards to certifications? And it sounds like it's useful at a period of time in your career.
Yeah, you've got to be really intentional about what you want the certification for. For people who just want to learn the industry, I think certifications can be really useful. Going and looking at certifications like the CISSP or the CISA and just seeing what kinds of functional areas and topics they cover can give you a really good insight into the kinds of things you need to learn. And then you can build a learning path around that, whether you end up getting the certification or not. There's a lot of people who will get a certification to get their first cybersecurity job. So whether it's a CompTIA certification or a Cisco networking engineer kind of certification or some generic entry-level cert is certainly a way to help elevate your profile if you're trying to get your first cybersecurity job, but I didn't need to do that because that wasn't sort of the thing when I was getting started. And there are plenty of jobs when you go look at what what hiring managers are asking for, they will specify a certain kind of certification. So a lot of pen testers might want to go and get a pen testing certification or an offensive security certification, for example. So I think they can help, but what they don't do is demonstrate that you know how to apply the knowledge you've learned in a real world environment. Not very well. They're getting better, but they're not quite there yet. So they're not an indication of mastery. They're an indication of awareness and knowledge. And as long as you understand that difference, I think you can use them really well and they're valuable. But if you think, oh, I'll get this certification and then I'll be able to do the job, you might be surprised that you're going to have a gap.
There's a gap, definitely.
Yeah, it's a gap. Mm-hmm. Right.
So what is one piece of advice you'd give to someone starting out in security? So maybe separately from the certifications.
Yeah. So there's a guy I follow who has a newsletter called Unsupervised Learning. His name's Daniel Messler, and he had a really great piece of advice that I read recently. So I'm going to use that to answer this question. It's useful rather than to think about what kind of security do I want to do, is to be able to think what kind of problem do I want to solve? And if you think about it through the lens of what problem are you trying to solve, it can help you be more intentional about then what kind of tooling do you need to learn? What kind of skills do you need to have? What kind of jobs facilitate solving that problem? And so that can give you some clarity around how to proceed with your cybersecurity career. Because to be honest, just to say, I want to do cybersecurity, it's a super big field and it's not going to be helpful for you to think that way. You're going to have to be a little bit more explicit. So thinking of it in terms of problems to be solved as opposed to jobs to be done can be a useful way of wrapping your head around that.
Yeah, so that sounds like definitely providing people with a direction before as rather than meandering through the field. It sounds like some advice would be to seek out a mentor along the way to help provide advice. A number of professionals provide mentoring advice, and there's a number of programs around for cybersecurity professionals for being mentored.
Yeah, absolutely. Having a network of people, which include mentors and sponsors and coaches, can be really useful. The other thing, I get to talk to a lot of people who reach out to me for career advice. And when I ask them why they reach out to me, they say, well, because you're a CISO. And that's fine. It's interesting to have conversations with the CISO. But if you're just starting your cybersecurity career, there is a long way between being an entry-level cyber person and being the person in charge of a security program at an organization. So what I suggest to people like that is find people who are 2 to 3 years ahead of you in your career path and make them your mentors, because they're going to know what the current market is. They're going to have closer experience to yours than someone like me. So I'm not saying don't talk to me. I'm just saying make sure that when you're going to look for a mentor, that you look for someone who's got sort of near time appropriate experience that's going to be more valid to you and more useful to you than someone like me.
That's some very good advice. I think people starting out early in their career, that's some great advice for helping them to find people that are only a few years ahead. Mm-hmm. Moving into some of your CISO background, with regards to security culture, traditionally cybersecurity has been seen as almost a department of no, the department that restricts access and slows down processes. How do you approach shifting this perception? And how do you demonstrate how security can enable business goals?
Yeah, I do think it's changing. I think it's changing for a couple of reasons. One is security people realize that they can't just show up and say no. They have to be able to show up and say, I understand what you're trying to achieve. Let me help you do that in as secure a way as possible. So I think that side of the coin has changed a little bit. I think the other side of the coin is non-security people are recognizing the value of security, and they're recognizing the risks that they take if they ignore security risk. And so we've got two sides willing to compromise on those conversations in ways that maybe 5 or 10 years ago we were less likely to do. So I think as a security leader then, or someone who's running a security function and you're trying to get non-security people to come along for the ride, I think it's a little bit easier than it used to be. But you still need to be in a situation of saying the role of security, the purpose of security isn't security, actually. The end isn't to be as secure as possible. The end is to do whatever the business is trying to do in a way that is as secure as they want it to be. And now a lot of people in security are control freaks and they want to be able to tell someone how secure it needs to be. And certainly if there's a law or a regulation that you must comply with, then, sometimes everyone's hands are tied in terms of how much autonomy they can have over that conversation. But in most cases, there isn't a law or regulation that says how something must be done. What the regulation will require is that there is some outcome or some concept of it that must be complied with. It leaves you a lot of discretion about how you can achieve something. So a security person should show up and say, okay, I'm working for a retail business and they want to do online sales. And in doing online sales, they need consumers to be able to access the website in as friction-free way as they possibly can. But we also don't want them to be the victim of identity theft and we don't want their data to be stolen. So how do you do that? So how do you give them a friction-free experience or as frictionless as possible that is also meeting our needs and our expectations of security? As long as a security person shows up like that, then the business non-security side of the world is probably going to be willing to have a conversation with them because we both want a friction-free, fraud-free experience. Like we have commonality in what the outcomes we're looking for. So as long as you try and find those things, then you can move towards that. Now, what gets really tiring is if you have a business partner who doesn't even want that. They just want you to go away and not talk to them and get out of their way and be invisible. Unfortunately, we still bump into people like that every now and again. And that's why you have a network of friends that you can come back and cry on their shoulder together with, because you're going to bump into some people like that. But fortunately, it's less and less these days than it used to be.
Yeah, I think I saw a meme or a comic recently. It was like, oh, I want to learn everything about cybersecurity. Okay, here you go, bing. And then the person is like, oh my God, I need a drink.
Yes. Absolutely.
With response to how bad it is out there with the state of security of organizations and what they're prepared to accept. And it can be a bit, the business's risk appetite may not be the same as your own risk appetite.
Yep.
But it's the business and their goals are what makes them drive the business.
That's right. That's right.
So can you share any examples, possibly in your past, of how you influenced an organization's culture to embrace security as a value add?
I'm a big believer in the power of governance structures and accountability structures within that. It's really, really difficult if you're a security person who's buried down deep in an IT organization and you're expected to, quote unquote, own the security of an organization from that position. It's a no-win situation when you're like that. So one of the things that security leaders try and do is to get to a place where there is top-down messaging related to the importance of security that drive the cultural change that you're looking for in an organization. But most leaders of an organization aren't security people, and they don't know the kinds of messaging that they need to give to the broader organization. So in one organization that I used to belong to, one of the things I did personally was anytime we had a new executive who came on board, I sat them down as part of their onboarding and talked to them about what their accountability was related to security within the organization. And for this particular organization, it was twofold. One, they had to have oversight as to the risk profile of their piece of the organization. And so I talked to them about, here are the tools I'm going to give you to do that. And here is my team is available to help you if you have any questions. And we're going to come to you with programs that are going to help improve things. And we're going to look for your support in those programs. So we set all that up. And then the other piece of their world was if there was a security incident, they had a responsibility in the incident response process. So training the leaders to say everybody has a role to play in detection and response went a long way to them understanding that that meant everybody in their organization, not just the security people and not just the IT people, had to understand that as well. So just doing that onboarding sort of, I call it training, but it was really relationship building with new leaders led to them also saying, oh, now I understand what your expectations are of me. How can you help me actually deliver these expectations? And I'd be like, oh, you're asking me to help you? Of course, here I am. So doing things like that can go a long way to changing the culture over time, because I believe culture changes from the top down, not the bottom up often.
Definitely.
So
it has to be from
the
top down. You need some champions at the top. I've seen people try to change it from the bottom, and you just get resistance. And unless at middle levels, and unless you're going to have the allies at the top, it's not going to work. Definitely.
That's right.
One of the challenges for CISOs is that some struggle to communicate the value of cybersecurity to other departments. Yeah. What practical strategies have you found successful in bridging this communications gap? I guess it's you've just described that in onboarding and bringing people up to speed. How do you bridge different departments' communication gaps and styles there?
This is one of those problems that every security leader has. And even though some people feel like they've got a way of managing that, you never know whether it's going to be successful because it's so highly dependent on the personalities and the culture of the organization that you're in. And we know that leadership personalities and partner personalities, that changes a lot, right? People come and go. And so every time you get a new leader, you've got to build a new relationship and you've got to build a new understanding, and it's sort of tough. That onboarding piece I talked about was really talking about what people were accountable for and what their expectations were. Implicit in that was, I assume that security is valuable to the organization. Sometimes I'll bump into a leader who already shares that same implicit understanding. Sometimes they don't, in which case you've got to have an explicit conversation with them. And in that case, there's a couple of ways to do that. One, you've got to do some storytelling. So you've got to tell the story of the business, and you've got to be able to tell the story of what the business looks like if there isn't a security culture or a security management understanding. And then you can tell the story of the business if there is. And so obviously the story if there isn't is that they don't achieve their business goals. And the story if there is that they're going to achieve not their security goals, but their business goals. So one is storytelling. And then you've got to back that up with some operational reporting and metrics and those kinds of things. And I'm not talking about scaring them with how many threats or attacks you're having in a given week, but to be able to help them understand that it's a journey, that you're never done, that it's a way of living and being, not a project that is one and done. And so being able to tailor how you measure that improvement in security over time is a part of that story as well, that you have to be able to tell them. And it's going to change. What those metrics exactly are going to change based on the industry you're in, the size of the organization, the type of organization, whether you're publicly traded or private or a government entity. I mean, all of the kind of technologies you use, it's a really sort of unicorn thing to get those metrics right. And that's why a good security leader is so invaluable, because they're going to be able to contextualize that story and those metrics according to the business that you're in.
So it's almost like a new normal of way of doing business these days. Is that that's something that we all have to become accustomed to protecting the business by providing security advice and influence and culture to the organization, but on having to always focus on the business goals and all the different organizations that different industries have different business goals. I remembered hearing one story that uptime was number one priority for a media organization. And so they needed to make sure that everything was uptime, and but they still needed to patch. And so they really needed to do downtime at some point. But the uptime was number one priority. So the security patching sort of fell by the wayside. But it's providing some security goals while reaching the business goals, as you've been describing.
That's right.
Now, moving to the metrics. So do you have any specific ones that you can talk about, or is it more of associated with previous organization that you may be able to share to measure the impact of your efforts to transform security teams?
Yeah, like I said, the metrics that you show up with are really going to be contextual to the organization you're a part of, and you've got to start where they are. So sometimes when I begin a security leadership program, whether that's as a CISO or as an individual sort of functional area owner, identity management or vulnerability management or whatever, you've got to start with where you are. So the first time you show up as a leader, as a new leader in an organization, some of it is just sort of reflecting back to the organization what you've observed. This is where I see strengths. This is where I see opportunities for improvement. These are the things that I think measure up well against your peers. And so understanding who your peer group is as an organization is really important to be able to benchmark yourself. If you can, like, benchmarks are useful, but they're not absolutes. So you could say, well, I'm a retail company, so I'm going to compare myself against other retail companies. Well, that's fine. But not every retail company has the same CEO or board of directors that you do. And that's going to change the culture, and that's going to change the risk tolerance. And so that changes how fast you can move and the kinds of things you can do. So starting out with, this is where I see us now, this is how fast I think we can see us moving, is an important metric. And the individual metrics are less important than the kinds of conversations that they generate. So sitting in front of a board and saying, this is what our security profile looks like, doesn't actually mean a whole bunch to anybody. Doesn't mean a whole bunch to the security person who always thinks you should do better. And it doesn't mean a whole bunch to the board, because they're like, well, is that good? Is that bad? Should we be doing something different? Is this acceptable, right? So what you want are metrics that are going to drive people to ask good questions. And at a board level, you want them to be able to reflect back to you as the security leader, this is what our risk tolerance is. This is acceptable to us. This isn't acceptable to us. So the kinds of metrics you put in front of them should be generating those kinds of questions. Is this an acceptable level of risk management? Should we be doing more or less? That's sort of the role of the board. With the C-suite then, if the board has established the risk profile that the organization should have, then you can have a conversation with the C-suite that says, either we're meeting that or we're not. And if we're not meeting that, what's the C-suite got to do to impact change in the organization so we get to the acceptable level of risk management? So those metrics are going to change over time too. There might be some things where everyone feels generally okay, and there are going to be other areas, and it might be training and awareness, or it might be our ability to patch in a timely manner or whatever. And we may want to focus just on those things for a little while. So really, a security leader doesn't sort of go in with a template of, I'm going to use these metrics no matter where I show up. You've got to be understanding the context of the organization before you put anything on paper.
So you'd almost have a set of metrics for the board and a slightly different set for the C-suite.
Absolutely.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah.
And in that first 100 days of your time in an organization, the first steps you do, as you're saying, is to assess the situation.
Yep.
Situational
Absolutely.
awareness, and then move to develop a gap analysis, and from then on, it's communications predominantly, as well as a bit of strategy.
Yes. So there's a book called The First 90 Days. It wasn't written for security people. It was just written for executives, but it talks about what you do as an incoming executive in the first 90 days of a new job. And what you want to do is going to depend on why you're there. Are you there because they want you to build a brand new program? Are you there because the program is failing and they want you to do a turnaround? All of those kinds of things play into it as well. But yeah, in general, the first 30 days are assessment. The second 30 days are planning your plan. And the last 30 days of the 90-day window are then validating with your stakeholders that the plan is good and beginning that plan, right? So assuming there are no dumpster fires that are currently burning that need immediate attention, right? That's sort of the first
name an
90 days.
organization that doesn't have that.
Everyone's got dumpsters, right? For sure.
Yeah. So in your experience across different industries, what are some common cybersecurity challenges that organizations face regardless of their sector? What's a common theme across sectors?
I think you can take it a few ways. I think everybody right now is still a little bit concerned, and some sectors are very concerned about the impact of ransomware and the impact of cyber events that are going to impact operations and operational capabilities, right? So it's one thing to have data loss. That's a problem, but it doesn't stop hospitals from saving patients or power grids from delivering power or whatever, right? And then you've got ransomware events that actually shut things down and stop things from moving. So I think people are generically worried about those kinds of events. I think more holistically than that, though, there are some common things when I talk to CISOs across multiple industries. One is we have a big reliance on non-security people to make good security decisions, and they may not understand how to make good decisions or what good decisions look like. So there is definitely a problem with our partners in our organizations in terms of their level of education and understanding of cybersecurity. So to give you sort of an example, most executives who run companies have some level of financial acumen. They've either been a finance person themselves, or they've been in sales, or they've done an MBA, and they understand how money works, right? You can't say the same thing for cybersecurity. We've got a lot of executives who've never had to think about threats, vulnerabilities, compensating controls, attack vectors, blast radiuses. They just don't know, right?
So one of the financial risks you're saying is from an example.
Right. So they understand how to have a conversation with the CFO. They don't have an understanding of how to have a conversation with the CISO. So one of the common problems across industries is education and language with influential partners. So that's a common one. I think the other thing is most of us are facing a patchwork of regulations that are often not coordinated. Sometimes they're contradictory. Sometimes they look really good on paper, but aren't fit for purpose for the kind of business that we are operating in. And so there's a big regulatory burden on most security teams. Even if they're not particularly in a regulated industry, there's still privacy regulations that have a security component or those kinds of things that they have to be taking into account. So the regulatory burden is very heavy on the security sector and people who are doing security for an organization that I don't think is fully appreciated by the rest of the organization. So that would be another one.
So newer ones coming in, like the SEC regulations and New York financial.
Yep.
They're only counting the GDPR, etc. The newer ones seem to be having their effect in that people are being more aware of it and not necessarily wanting to be regulated as such. But there's a lot more reports of ransomware or is cyber incidents that have occurred, not necessarily ransomware, that are being reported, which is good. So, but from a detective mechanism, a lot of companies are keeping it quiet up until now. And it's it's starting to see some of the numbers coming in on a weekly to a monthly basis. It's very interesting to see from someone that works in the industry, but is not running a business specifically for being affected by ransomware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of interesting for me to see too that the SEC regulations for publicly traded companies in the United States has been interesting to watch because what they're asking for is for companies to decide whether or not an incident is material. And then from the point that from the time they decide an incident is material And they get to decide what makes it material, by the way. There's not clear guidelines around materiality either. But from the point that they do that, they've then got 4 days to come up with the statement and do the official notifications of the incident. And even in the last 3 or 4 months since that rule went into effect, we've seen a very marked change in the quality of the reporting that's coming out from companies that not only say, oh, we've had a thing, but we don't really know too much about it right now, but here's a thing, to we've had an incident. This is what we know about the incident. These are the kinds of things within our business that are going to be impacted or have been impacted. This is where we think we're headed. I mean, the quality has just got better just in 3 or 4 months. So I'm hoping the trend continues, but it certainly hasn't been easy for the security teams and the compliance teams and all the people who get involved in those materiality notices. It's certainly shaken up the industry quite a bit.
From the team's perspective, it would be taking up a lot more work. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
But
yes.
From a data perspective, it's interesting to see the numbers that are coming in and the effects that in Australia, we're starting to get a bit more occurrences happening. But just some of the timings of notifications, for example, all in the US, all happening on a Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. seems to be a common theme. Yep. If we're not dealing with individual actual incidents happening on a Friday at 5 p.m., we're also, the notifications are going in then too.
It's a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, doing an SEC notification at 4 or 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon means that the markets aren't necessarily going to respond that they have time to sort of calm down before a response happens, right? Which is why they do it. From an operational perspective, though, those notifications have to happen if you have an incident in your supply chain. So if a company who's a publicly traded company says at 4 o'clock on a Friday that they've had an incident, and that company happens to be in my supply chain, that means now that the security and IT teams at my company are pulling weekend hours, if they weren't already pulling weekend hours, to be able to evaluate whether that particular incident means that my organization now has to notify somebody, right? So because the SEC said you have to talk about this if it's material, and if it's in your supply chain, it can be material. Every notification like this has a knock-on effect of impacting everybody else who's in the supply chain operationally. And that sort of piece of it is still shaking out as well.
Yeah, I remembered reading some of the statistics is that there's companies are pulling back, disconnecting from their suppliers as when they've been notified, just in case there's a theory of lateral movement potentially happening as an attacker jumping from one company's data networks to another.
Yeah. Well, 2 things about that. One is if you're only pulling back after you've been notified of a breach, it's probably too late. And 2, a lot of times the people in your supply chain are critical and you can't pull back. So not without impacting your own operations anyway. So yeah,
and does that come into your business continuity plans and disaster recovery in the case of cyber incident at a supplier? Then this is what needs to happen for each supplier in that case.
This is the other thing that's sort of happened. If you look at the Change Healthcare problem that happened here in the United States, right? So Change Healthcare it was a big company, but it was sort of buried within the supply chain ether of healthcare. So it wasn't a hospital, right? It was a claims processing piece of the supply chain. And it wasn't until they were ransomware and they were unable to process claims and they were unable to pre-approve surgeries and all of those things that people realized how critical this particular company was to the overall healthcare supply chain in the United States. And we're seeing this everywhere is, when you think about your critical supply chain, it's not just the person or the organization 1 degree removed from you. It's 2nd and 3rd and 4th degree removed from you. And a lot of the security teams don't have visibility to 3 or 4 layers down into the supply chain. So even being able to say, what is your supply chain risk? No one knows because they don't have visibility to the entire supply chain, not even the federal government yet. So we're starting to see now changes and parts of the security industry start to focus on this problem of it's not a supply chain, it's a supply web. And how do we have visibility across the whole mesh or the whole web that is your supply ecosystem? We haven't been able to
Let's
really
turn
do
it
that
into
very
a
well.
3D model. That's a good description. My experience has been that some of the APRA financial regulator in Australia was moving towards third-party risk and third parties. And I think I read somewhere one of the regulators was just moving towards fourth party, including fourth parties. So we're still 6 degrees of separation away from any sort of mesh but that'll be interesting to see, to map out. But it's another one of those, will it be the just getting that visibility, will it be that'll take a lot of resources to do that, a lot of time, effort and money.
Yes, absolutely. So, you're seeing federal governments across the planet put a lot of pressure on manufacturers and software developers who are arguably at the top of the food or at the beginning of the food chain, right? To do secure by design and secure from the start, so that you take the pressure off middle organizations in the supply chain to have to worry about the security of the solution or the security of the software or whatever. So this is why you're seeing secure from the start kind of legislation pop up now too.
Yeah, the US federal government's been pushing it as well, not just CISA. Yep. So it's
the Five Eyes in general. I mean, a lot of the regulations coming out of the US, we're seeing out of Australia, New Zealand, England, India, Canada, right? So there's a lot of collaboration, which is a good thing, I think.
Definitely. You mentioned your deep engagement in the security community. Can you elaborate on how this involvement benefits your work as a CISO and the organization you work for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the longer you stay in security, the bigger your network gets. It's inevitable a little bit. I've had the fortune too, though, of being able to do a lot of public speaking engagements, which brings me to a lot of conferences. And I'm engaged with a lot of networking groups for CISOs that are international in their scope. It's really interesting to me to get everybody's opinion. As I mentioned earlier, I think what your security program is and does is driven a lot by the context of the organization you're doing it in. So I've worked for a Wall Street bank. I've worked for a large research university. I'm now working for a tech firm in San Francisco. And we all do security, but we do it a slightly different way. Because I've got industry connections, I get, even though my personal career has been with these big companies all the way through, because of my connections, I get to deal with CISOs who are working with technology startups, and I get to work with healthcare industry CISOs, and I get to talk to and understand the experience of people who are doing security in retail, for example. All of those things are places where I can get information that I can bring back to my company and infuse into the programs that I'm doing. There's learnings to be had in all of those areas. But if I'm not talking to those people in my network, I'm not thinking about those things because I'm not walking in their shoes. So, for example, when I was the CISO of a research university, I was talking to a colleague of mine who happened to be the CISO of a very big retailer, international retailer, who does a lot of online stuff. And I was talking about denial of service attacks that were happening on my student networks, where students were in their dorms playing computer games, and they would tick off somebody in the game room, and the player they were playing against would DDoS my network, denial of service my network, and my entire student network was taken offline because I had this upset gamer from one of my students. So I'm talking to this CISO from retail. He's like, well, we have this DDoS problem. Every time our company puts some big, well-known retail item for sale, we have all these bots that come and try and knock our web platform offline because they're trying to get to the front of the line to buy, I don't know, Nike basketball shoes or whatever it is that they're selling. So we were able to go, well, how do you deal with denial of service attacks? What do you do to prevent that kind of thing from happening? And I was able to compare my notes from what I was doing at the university. And while the scale and scope and the dollar impact are really different, the technology solutions were actually really similar, right? So just being able to leverage people broadly across multiple verticals and multiple different sizes of organizations is really useful. The other thing that happens is because I've got people in these different industries, they get exposed to different security vendors that I would. And so if I'm going, hey, I've got this problem, I'm trying to solve it. Have you solved for this yet? What vendors are you working with to solve for this problem? I'd be able to reach out to those people and word of mouth, get an understanding of what was out there without having to go and ask a vendor for that information whose email list I'm inevitably never going to get cut off from then, right? So it gives me backdoor channel ways of sort of doing some data analysis around problems that I can then bring back to my company.
How do you find the connections with, as you've been in the industry and the community for a while, and the more time that you spend in the industry and the more connections that you make throughout the work experience and through the community, such as conferences and hallway chats, how do you find that expanding over time? And having had that network for a while now, that must be, and everyone in those positions that you've met over the years has probably risen through the ranks as well. So it will probably give you a good sounding board for different industries and for different experts in different roles, not just CISOs, but leaders in the individual disciplines.
Yeah, for sure. It's a bit of a flywheel kind of thing. If you don't engage with the security community, if you just show up at your company and do your job and stick your head down and do your job, that's all fine. But if you want to advance, if you want to get senior leader kind of skill sets, if you want to understand the industry really holistically, you've got to engage with the industry outside of your immediate company, right? And so for me, I had to do that when I was looking for mid-career new jobs. Like when I was early in career, it was easy for me to stick my head down and just focus on my immediate organization. But at some point I hit this level where I was like, if I want my next job, it's not going to be with my immediate company. I'm going to have to stick my head up and look out. And in doing that, it was social media. So at the time, Twitter, but LinkedIn, Mastodon, whatever your social media platform is of choice, starting to contribute in, not just watch materials that go by from that was one. Speaking at conferences meant, one, people got to know my name and my face, but two, they could come up to me afterwards if they had questions. And that led to people going, oh, Helen, I'm here asking you a question, but do you know this guy over here who happens to be the CISO of this company over here? Let me introduce you, right? So that grew. And then it was just sort of word of mouth that you then ended up in these spaces with people together. Either I was on podcasts with people together, webinars, panels, those kinds of things. And at some point, I sort of was invited to be in closed groups. So there, in the security industry, there are a lot of networking groups that aren't officially part of a professional organization like an ISC squared or an ISSA or a WSIS or whatever. These are just people who share a common sort of understanding of security, and you get invited to be in these spaces. And then there's a Slack channel or a Discord channel or whatever, and you get together and you chat. And sometimes it just stays online, and sometimes it becomes, hey, when we're all at the next big conference at the same time, like an RSA or a Black Hat or whatever, or a B-Sides conference or whatever, why don't we connect in person and catch up in the hallway? And so over time, your network just sort of expands, but you've got to keep feeding into it. If you just sit there and watch it, people will forget who you are. You've got to sort of show up and have an opinion and ask questions and offer to help and do all of those things. But if you do those things, you get the benefit back of this really vibrant community. And the thing I really like about cybersecurity as an industry, even though it's growing and growing and growing, it's still really intimate, actually, and people want to help each other. So I like the people who are in this industry. And so being part of these networking groups feeds that for me too.
That will definitely help. If you didn't connect with, didn't like them to begin with, then that would make it a little bit harder.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That wraps up part one of our fascinating conversation with the one and only Helen Patton here on the Cyber Consulting Room podcast. We want to express our sincere gratitude to Helen for sharing her incredible insights on cultivating a people-centric approach to cybersecurity. Her passion for empowering both individuals and organizations to thrive in today's ever-evolving technological landscape truly shone through. This interview with Helen Patton is just the tip of the iceberg. To hear the full depth of her knowledge and experience, be sure to tune in next episode for part 2. In the meantime, remember to like and subscribe to the Cyber Consulting Room podcast wherever you get your podcasts. By subscribing, you won't miss a single episode filled with valuable insights from top cybersecurity experts like Helen Patton. Until next time, stay safe and secure and keep listening to the Cyber Consulting Room podcast.